The jet was heading toward London, and Marcus was already thinking about the next few days. This was not his first trip to England, but it was different from his usual business visits. This time, he was traveling as a tourist, something he rarely did anymore. His schedule was packed with exclusive experiences that most people could only dream of. Private tours, expensive dinners, and meetings with wealthy collectors who wanted to sell him rare items for his growing collection of historical artifacts. Marcus had grown up in a small town in Ohio where his father worked at a factory and his mother cleaned houses for wealthy families. He remembered being 12 years old and going with his mother to work sometimes during school holidays. He would sit in the kitchen while she cleaned the big houses, watching the rich families come and go. Even then, he promised himself that one day he would be the one living in houses like that. He would be the one with money and power. That promise had driven him through college, where he studied computer science and business. While other students were partying, Marcus was working on his first app in his dorm room. The app was simple but clever. It helped people find and share local events with their friends. Then 6 months, it had millions of users. Then 2 years, bigger companies were trying to buy it from him. Marcus sold it for $50 million when he was just 23 years old. But $50 million was just the beginning. Marcus used that money to start his next company, a social media platform that would eventually become one of the biggest in the world. He hired the smartest people he could find, worked 18-hour days, and made decisions that other people thought were crazy. When everyone said social media was just a trend, Marcus bet everything on it. When others were worried about privacy concerns, Marcus focused on growth. His platform grew from thousands to millions to billions of users. The success had changed him in ways he did not always recognize. Money had a way of making problems disappear, and Marcus had gotten used to getting what he wanted when he wanted it. If he wanted a table at a busy restaurant, his assistant would make it happen. If he wanted to buy a painting from a private collector, his lawyers would find a way. If he wanted to fly somewhere at the last minute, his jet was always ready. This trip to London was Marcus showing off his wealth in a different way. He had paid nearly $500,000 for experiences that were not normally available to the public. He would get a private tour of parts of Buckingham Palace that most tourists never saw. He would have dinner with members of the British aristocracy who rarely met with Americans. He would visit private art collections that were usually closed to outsiders. Sarah looked up from her laptop and walked over to Marcus. She was in her early 30s, smart and efficient, and had been working for Marcus for 3 years. She had learned to anticipate what he needed before he asked for it, and she was one of the few people who was not afraid to disagree with him when necessary. "Marcus, we will be landing in London in 2 hours," Sarah said, sitting down across from him. "Your first appointment is tomorrow morning at 10. The palace tour you requested has been arranged, and they have agreed to your special requirements. The guide will meet you at the main entrance, and you will have access to areas that are normally restricted to the public." Marcus nodded without looking up from his phone. He was reading news articles about himself, something he did more often than he liked to admit. Most of the articles were about his business deals or his donations to charity. A few were about his personal life, though he tried to keep that private. The media seemed fascinated by the fact that he was 40 years old and had never been married. They were always trying to link him romantically with actresses or other wealthy women, but Marcus had learned to ignore most of that gossip. "Good," Marcus said, finally looking at Sarah. "And the other arrangements? What about the collector who wants to sell me those medieval manuscripts? He said he had some rare pieces that would be perfect for my collection." Sarah checked her notes. "He will meet you on Wednesday afternoon at his estate outside London. He has agreed to bring the manuscripts you were interested in, and he says he has some other items that might interest you as well. The price range is what you expected, between $2 and $5 million, depending on which pieces you choose." Marcus smiled. Money was just numbers to him now. $5 million was less than he made in a typical day from his various investments and business interests. Spending that much on old books and artifacts was not about the money. It was about owning things that other people could not have. It was about being able to walk through his private museum and know that he possessed items that were hundreds of years old, items that had been owned by kings and queens and famous historical figures. The plane began its descent toward London, and Marcus looked out the window at the city below. The Thames River wound through the buildings like a silver ribbon, and he could see the famous landmarks that millions of tourists came to visit every year. Big Ben, the Tower of London, Westminster Abbey. Soon he would be walking through places that those tourists could only see from the outside. Marcus did not realize it yet, but this trip would change his life in ways he could never have imagined. In less than 24 hours, he would make a decision that would shock the world and force him to confront the person he had become. But for now, he was just a wealthy man arriving in London, confident in his power and certain that his money could buy him anything he wanted. James was 28 years old, though the discipline and experience in his eyes made him look older. He had joined the British Army when he was 18, straight out of school. His father had been a soldier and his grandfather before him. Military service was a family tradition, but for James it was more than that. It was a calling. He believed in serving his country, in protecting people who could not protect themselves, and in standing for something bigger than himself. The first 6 years of his military career had been spent in training and stationed in England. James had been a good soldier, following orders without question and earning the respect of his fellow soldiers and his commanding officers. He was known for his steady nerves and his ability to stay calm under pressure. These qualities had served him well when he was deployed to Afghanistan for his first tour of duty. Afghanistan had changed James in ways that he was still trying to understand. The heat, the dust, the constant threat of danger, and the knowledge that every day could be your last. James had seen things that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He had lost friends in explosions and firefights. He had held dying soldiers in his arms and watched young men barely out of their teens take their last breaths thousands of miles from home. But James had also seen the best of humanity in that desert country. I'd seen soldiers risk their lives to save strangers. He had seen medics work for hours to save a wounded enemy fighter. He had seen acts of courage and selflessness that reminded him why he had chosen to serve. During his 3 tours in Afghanistan, James had been awarded 2 medals for bravery and had been recommended for promotion several times. The most difficult part of his service had not been the combat or the fear. It had been coming home. James had a younger sister named Emma, who was 24 years old. Emma had been born with cerebral palsy, a condition that affected her movement and speech. She lived in a care facility near their family home, and James visited her every weekend when he was in England. Emma was the most important person in his life, and everything he did was partly for her. Emma could not work or live independently, and her care was expensive. The government provided some assistance, but it was not enough to cover all her needs. James sent most of his military pay to help with her care, and he had been saving money for years to buy her a better wheelchair and to pay for treatments that might help her condition. Emma never complained about her situation, but James could see in her eyes that she dreamed of doing things that other people took for granted. When James completed his 3rd tour in Afghanistan, he had been offered a chance to continue his military career as an officer. The promotion would have meant more money and more responsibility, but it would also have meant more time away from Emma. James had struggled with the decision for months. He wanted to continue serving his country, but he also wanted to be there for his sister. The solution had come from an unexpected source. James had been approached by a recruiter for the Queen's Guard, the ceremonial unit that protected the royal family and their residences. The position would allow him to continue his military service while staying in London. Close to Emma, the pay was decent, and the schedule would give him time to visit his sister regularly. Most importantly, it was a position of honor that would let him continue serving his country in a different way. Becoming a Queen's Guard had required months of additional training. James had learned the precise movements and protocols that governed every aspect of the job. He had practiced standing motionless for hours at a time, regardless of weather or distractions. He had memorized the history and traditions of the Guard, and he had sworn an oath to protect the royal family. With his life, if necessary, the tourists who came to see the Guards often did not understand that this was not just a show or a tourist attraction. James and his fellow Guards were real soldiers with real weapons and real responsibilities. They had all served in combat zones, and they all took their duties seriously. The colorful uniforms and the ceremony were part of British tradition. But underneath the pageantry were trained military professionals who would respond to any threat. James had been serving as a Queen's Guard for 8 months now, and he had learned to ignore the crowds of tourists who gathered around his post every day. They took pictures, made jokes, and sometimes tried to get him to react or move. James had been trained to remain motionless and silent unless there was a real emergency. He had been shouted at, had objects thrown at him, and had been the target of pranks and insults. He endured it all with patience and professionalism. The hardest part of the job was not the physical demands or the tourist behavior. It was the financial pressure that James still felt every day. His military pension from his service in Afghanistan was smaller than he had hoped, and the Queen's Guard's salary was not enough to cover all of Emma's needs. James had been working extra shifts and taking on additional duties to earn more money, but it was never quite enough. He had been forced to take out loans to pay for some of Emma's treatments, and the debt was growing faster than he could pay it off. James never talked about his financial struggles with his fellow guards or his commanding officers. He had been raised to believe that you solved your own problems and did not burden others with your troubles. Emma did not know how much he was sacrificing for her care, and James intended to keep it that way. She worried about him enough already, especially after his tours in Afghanistan. On this particular morning, James was thinking about Emma as he stood at his post. She had been having health problems recently. Her doctors were recommending a new treatment that was not covered by insurance. The treatment could help her condition significantly, but it would cost more money than James had saved. He had been considering taking a second job, but he was already working as many hours as his Queen's Guard duties would allow. As James stood in the morning sun, watching the crowds of tourists gathering in the palace courtyard, he had no idea that his life was about to change in ways he could never have imagined. In a few hours, he would meet a man whose actions would test everything he believed about duty, honor, and forgiveness. But for now, he was just a soldier doing his job, thinking about his sister, and hoping that somehow he would find a way to give her the care she needed and deserved. The palace courtyard was already busy with tourists taking pictures and tour groups gathering around their guides. Marcus looked at them with a mixture of amusement and irritation. These people were here to see the same things he was about to see, but they would only get the standard tours that thousands of other visitors experienced every day. Marcus had paid a fortune to get access to areas that were normally closed to the public, and he intended to get his money's worth. A palace official in a dark suit approached Marcus and Sarah as they reached the main entrance. The man was polite but formal, exactly what Marcus expected from British palace staff. He introduced himself as William Henderson, the tour coordinator, who would be handling Marcus's special visit. "Mr. Wellington, welcome to Buckingham Palace," Henderson said with a slight bow. "We have arranged the private tour you requested, and we will be able to show you several areas that are not normally open to the public. However, I must remind you that there are certain protocols and restrictions that we need to follow, even for our VIP guests." Marcus nodded impatiently. He had heard similar speeches at other exclusive locations around the world. There were always rules and restrictions, but Marcus had learned that money and persistence could usually overcome most obstacles. He was confident that he would be able to see everything he wanted to see and get the photos he needed for his social media accounts. The tour began in the staterooms, where Marcus was shown paintings and furniture that had been used by British royalty for centuries. Henderson provided detailed explanations about the history and significance of each item, but Marcus was only half listening. He was more interested in taking photos of himself with the expensive artifacts. He posed next to paintings worth millions of dollars and sat in chairs that had been used by kings and queens. As they moved through the palace, Marcus became increasingly demanding. He wanted to take photos in areas where photography was not allowed. He wanted to touch artifacts that were behind protective barriers. He wanted to go into rooms that were not part of the tour. Each time Henderson politely explained the restrictions, Marcus would argue or offer to pay extra money to get what he wanted. After an hour of touring the interior of the palace, Henderson led Marcus and Sarah outside to see the famous Queen's Guard. This was one of the most popular attractions for tourists, and Marcus had specifically requested to spend time photographing the guards in their colorful uniforms. He had plans to post the photos on his social media accounts with captions about his exclusive access to British royalty. James Morrison was standing at his post near the palace entrance when Marcus and his group approached. James had been on duty for 3 hours already, and he was thinking about Emma and the medical bills that were piling up at home. He had received a call from the care facility that morning, informing him that Emma needed additional treatments that would cost several £1,000s. James was trying to figure out how he could possibly afford the treatments when the wealthy tourists approached his position. Marcus immediately pulled out his phone and started taking photos of James from different angles. He moved around the guard, snapping pictures and recording videos without asking permission. Henderson tried to explain that there were guidelines for interacting with the guards, but Marcus ignored him. He was focused on getting the perfect shot for his social media accounts. "I want to get a photo with the guard," Marcus announced, moving closer to James. "This will be perfect for my Instagram account. My followers will love seeing me with one of the famous British guards." Henderson stepped forward nervously. "Mr. Wellington, the guards are not permitted to pose for photographs with visitors. They are on active duty and must maintain their position and composure at all times. You are welcome to take photos of the guard from a respectful distance, but please do not try to interact with him directly." Marcus looked at Henderson with annoyance. He had paid a massive amount of money for this experience, and he was not going to be told what he could and could not do. He had been photographed with celebrities, politicians, and other famous people around the world. A palace guard was not going to refuse to take a photo with him. "Look, I paid a lot of money for this tour," Marcus said, his voice getting louder. "I want a photo with the guard, and I am going to get one. This is ridiculous. I could buy this whole palace if I wanted to." James remained perfectly still during this exchange, staring straight ahead as he had been trained to do. He could hear every word that Marcus was saying, but he was not allowed to respond or react in any way. The guard training had taught him to ignore distractions and provocations, no matter how rude or insulting they might be. Marcus moved even closer to James, holding his phone up to take a selfie. He positioned himself right next to the guard and started taking multiple photos. When the photos did not turn out the way he wanted, Marcus became frustrated. He wanted James to turn his head or change his expression, but the guard remained motionless. "Come on, just look at the camera for 1 second," Marcus said, waving his hand in front of James's face. "I am not asking for much. Just one photo. I will pay you for it if that is what you want." James continued to stare straight ahead, his jaw clenched slightly, but his expression unchanged. He was thinking about his military training and his oath to serve with honor and dignity. He was also thinking about Emma and how much he needed this job to pay for her care. He could not afford to do anything that might jeopardize his position as a Queen's Guard. Henderson was becoming increasingly uncomfortable with the situation. He could see that Marcus was getting more agitated, and he was worried about what might happen next. He tried to redirect Marcus's attention to other parts of the palace grounds, but the billionaire was fixated on getting the photo he wanted. "This is unacceptable," Marcus said, his voice now loud enough that other tourists were starting to notice the commotion. "I am a very important person, and I deserve better treatment than this. I could make one phone call and have this guard fired. I could buy this whole country if I wanted to." The words hung in the air like a challenge. James could feel his heart rate increasing, but he forced himself to remain calm and motionless. He had faced enemy fire in Afghanistan and had been trained to stay cool under pressure. He was not going to let an arrogant tourist break his composure, no matter how insulting or threatening the man became. Marcus was now completely focused on James, seeing the guard's refusal to react as a personal insult. In his mind, this was about more than just a photo. This was about respect and power and getting what he wanted. He had never been denied anything that money could buy, and he was not going to start now with a palace guard who probably earned in a year what Marcus made in an hour. The tension in the courtyard was building, and other tourists were starting to gather around to watch what was happening. Sarah was trying to calm Marcus down, and Henderson was looking around nervously for additional security. James remained at his post, every muscle in his body tense, but his face showing no emotion. None of them realized that in the next few moments, Everything would change in a way that would shock the world and alter both men's lives forever. "You think you are better than me?" Marcus shouted, his voice echoing off the palace walls. "I have more money than you will ever see in your entire life. I could buy 100 guards like you, could buy this whole palace and everyone in it. You are nothing but a man in a costume standing around for tourists to take pictures of." James continued to stare straight ahead, his jaw clenched so tightly that the muscles in his neck were visible. Every instinct in his body was telling him to respond, to defend himself, to show this arrogant man what a real soldier was capable of. But his training and his oath held him in place. He thought about Emma and how much she needed him to keep this job. He thought about his fellow soldiers who had died in Afghanistan and how they would want him to honor his duty. He remained perfectly still. Henderson was frantically trying to defuse the situation, but Marcus was beyond reasoning. Sarah was pulling at her boss's arm, trying to get him to walk away from the confrontation. Palace officials were moving toward the scene, but they were not fast enough to prevent what happened next. The crowd of tourists was growing larger, and many of them were recording the scene with their phones, not realizing they were about to witness an international incident. Marcus raised his voice even louder, and his words became more insulting and personal. He made fun of James's uniform, calling it a silly costume from a bygone era, mocked the British traditions and customs that James had sworn to protect. He threatened to use his wealth and influence to get James fired from his position. With each word, Marcus became more aggressive and more out of control. The breaking point came when Marcus grabbed James by the shoulder and tried to force him to turn and face the camera. This was a direct violation of protocol and a physical assault on a member of the Queen's Guard. James could not move or react, but his body tensed as he felt the unwelcome touch. Marcus was now shouting directly into James's ear, calling him names and threatening him with consequences if he did not cooperate. When James still did not respond, Marcus lost all control of his temper. In a moment of pure rage and entitlement, he drew back his hand and struck James hard across the face. The sound of the slap echoed through the courtyard like a gunshot, and for a moment, everything went completely silent. Even the birds seemed to stop singing as the reality of what had just happened sank in. James's head snapped to the side from the force of the blow, and a red mark immediately appeared on his cheek. His eyes watered from the impact, but he did not move from his position. He did not raise his hand to touch his face or take a step backward. He simply straightened his head and resumed staring straight ahead, though his breathing had become faster and his hands were clenched into fists at his sides. The tourists in the courtyard gasped collectively, and several people screamed. Dozens of phones were recording the scene, and the footage was already being uploaded to social media before Marcus had even realized what he had done. Henderson stood frozen in shock. Unable to believe that a VIP guest had just physically assaulted a member of the Queen's Guard, Sarah covered her mouth with her hands. Knowing that her boss had just made a terrible mistake that would have serious consequences, palace security officers appeared within seconds, moving quickly toward Marcus and the scene of the assault. They were dressed in plain clothes, but their purpose was clear as they surrounded the billionaire. Marcus seemed to come out of his rage-induced trance and looked around at the crowd of shocked faces staring at him. He realized that dozens of people had witnessed his attack on the guard, and many of them were still recording with their phones. "Sir, you need to come with us right now," one of the security officers said in a calm but firm voice. "You are under arrest for assaulting a member of the Queen's Guard. You have the right to remain silent, and anything you say can and will be used against you in court." Marcus looked at the security officer with confusion and disbelief. He had never been arrested before in his life, and he could not understand why he was being treated like a criminal. In his mind, he had simply been trying to get a photo with a guard who was being uncooperative. He had not intended to cause an international incident or to assault anyone. "This is ridiculous," Marcus said, his voice now much quieter than it had been moments before. "I am a very important person. I am a guest of this palace. I paid a lot of money to be here. You cannot arrest me for something so minor. I will call my lawyers and have this sorted out within the hour." Security Officers were not impressed by Marcus's claims of importance or his threats to call lawyers. They had seen the assault with their own eyes, and they had a job to do. They placed handcuffs on Marcus's wrists and began to lead him away from the scene. Sarah followed behind them, already on her phone trying to contact Marcus's legal team and his public relations specialists. As Marcus was being led away, he looked back at James, who was still standing at his post despite everything that had happened. The guard's face was red where Marcus had struck him, but his expression remained professional and composed. James was looking straight ahead, doing his job exactly as he had been trained to do, even though he had just been physically assaulted in front of hundreds of people. The crowd of tourists was buzzing with excitement and shock. Many of them were already sharing the videos they had recorded on social media, adding captions about the crazy American billionaire who had slapped a British guard. The story was spreading across the internet at lightning speed, and within minutes, news outlets around the world were picking up the footage and running stories about the incident. Henderson was trying to restore order to the situation, but it was clear that the damage had been done. He radioed for additional security to help control the crowd and to ensure that James was not disturbed further. He also contacted his supervisors to report what had happened and to request guidance on how to handle the media attention that was sure to follow. James remained at his post for the rest of his shift, though his mind was racing with thoughts about what had just happened. He could feel the eyes of tourists on him, and he knew that his face was probably going to be seen by millions of people. Around the world, he thought about Emma and wondered if she would see the videos on the news. He thought about his fellow guards and his commanding officers and how they would react to the incident. Most of all, James thought about the man who had struck him. Marcus Wellington was obviously wealthy and powerful, but in that moment of rage, he had shown himself to be just another person, who believed that money could buy him the right to treat other people however he wanted. James had met men like that before, both in the military and in civilian life. They always thought they were above the rules that governed everyone else. As the afternoon wore on and James's shift finally ended, he had no idea that the incident would soon reveal information about his own life that would shock Marcus Wellington and change both of their lives forever. The slap that had lasted only seconds would have consequences that would ripple out for months to come, affecting not just the two men involved, but millions of people around the world who would see the footage and learn their stories. Sarah had been working frantically since Marcus's arrest, calling his team of lawyers and public relations experts. She had also been monitoring social media and news websites, watching in horror as the story of her boss's assault on the palace guard spread across the internet like wildfire. The videos recorded by tourists were being shared millions of times, and news outlets around the world were running the story as their lead headline. The footage was devastating for Marcus's reputation. It showed him clearly losing his temper, shouting at the guard and then striking him across the face. The contrast between Marcus's expensive clothes and aggressive behavior and James's calm professionalism made the billionaire look even worse. Social media users were calling Marcus a bully, a spoiled rich man, and much worse. His own social media platforms, ironically, were being used to spread criticism of his actions. Marcus's lawyers arrived at the police station within 3 hours of his arrest. They were some of the most expensive and experienced criminal defense attorneys in London, flown in specifically to handle this crisis. They immediately began working to get Marcus released on bail and to minimize the legal consequences of his actions. However, they warned him that the case would likely receive enormous media attention and that the charges were serious. While Marcus was dealing with the legal system, journalists around the world were digging deeper into the story. They wanted to know more about both men involved in the incident. Marcus Wellington was already famous, so his background was well known, but James Morrison was a mystery to most people. The journalists began investigating who this palace guard was and why he had shown such remarkable restraint when faced with such provocation. The first breakthrough came when a reporter from the BBC contacted the Ministry of Defense to ask about James's military background. The spokesperson was initially reluctant to provide details, but eventually confirmed that James Morrison was a decorated veteran who had served 3 tours of duty in Afghanistan. This information immediately changed the tone of the news coverage, as people realized that Marcus had not just slapped any palace guard, but a war hero. More details about James's military service began to emerge over the next few hours. Journalists discovered that he had been awarded the Military Cross for exceptional bravery during a Taliban attack on his base in Helmand province. The citation described how James had run into enemy fire to rescue 3 wounded soldiers, carrying them to safety one by one while under heavy gunfire. He had also received commendations for his leadership and his dedication to his fellow soldiers. The story became even more compelling when reporters learned about James's personal life. They discovered that he had a younger sister named Emma, who suffered from cerebral palsy and required constant care. Interviews with neighbors and family friends revealed that James sent most of his salary to pay for Emma's medical treatments and care facility expenses. He had been struggling financially for years, working extra shifts and taking on additional duties to earn enough money to support his sister. Medical records that were legally obtained by journalists showed the extent of Emma's condition and the cost of her treatments. She needed specialized therapy, medications, and equipment that cost thousands of pounds every month. James's military pension and his salary as a Queen's Guard were barely enough to cover these expenses, and he had been taking out loans to pay for additional treatments that might improve his sister's quality of life. The contrast between Marcus's wealth and James's financial struggles became a central part of the story. News reports described how Marcus had paid nearly $500,000 for his exclusive palace tours, while James was working multiple jobs to afford his sister's medical care. Social media users began sharing the details of James's story, praising him for his sacrifice and dedication to his family, while condemning Marcus for his entitled behavior. Public opinion turned decisively against Marcus as more details emerged. People were outraged that a billionaire had physically attacked a war veteran who was struggling to care for his disabled sister. Petitions were started calling for Marcus to face the full consequences of his actions. Boycotts were organized against his companies and social media platforms. His stock prices began to fall as investors worried about the damage to his reputation and his businesses. Marcus remained in his cell for most of the day, largely unaware of how the story was developing in the media. His lawyers were keeping him informed about the legal proceedings, but they were not telling him about the public relations disaster that was unfolding. They were focused on getting him released and avoiding a lengthy prison sentence, not on managing his image or his business interests. When Marcus was finally released on bail late that evening, he was shocked to discover the extent of the media coverage. Sarah met him outside the police station with a car and a security team, and she briefed him on what had happened while he was in custody. She showed him some of the news articles and social media posts, and Marcus could hardly believe what he was reading. "The man I slapped is a war hero," Marcus asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "He has a disabled sister that he takes care of. He is struggling to pay for her medical treatments, and I called him worthless and hit him in front of hundreds of people." Sarah nodded grimly. "The story is everywhere, Marcus. Every major news outlet in the world is covering it. Your name is trending on social media, and none of it is positive. People are calling for boycotts of your companies. Some of your business partners are already distancing themselves from you. This is the biggest crisis your reputation has ever faced." Marcus felt sick to his stomach as the reality of the situation sank in. He had built his fortune and his reputation over decades of hard work and smart business decisions. In a moment of anger and entitlement, he had potentially destroyed everything he had worked for. But more than that, he was beginning to understand the true impact of his actions on James Morrison. Marcus had always prided himself on being a self-made man who had risen from poverty to incredible wealth. He had forgotten what it was like to struggle, to worry about money, to sacrifice for family. James Morrison was living the life that Marcus had left behind long ago, but James was doing it with honor and dignity, serving his country and caring for his sister without complaint or self-pity. The more Marcus learned about James, the more ashamed he became of his own behavior. He realized that he had attacked a man who represented everything that was good and noble about human nature. James had faced enemy fire in Afghanistan, had saved the lives of his fellow soldiers, and was now working multiple jobs to care for his disabled sister. Marcus had slapped him because he would not pose for a photograph. As Marcus sat in his hotel room that night, reading news article after news article about the incident, He began to understand that this was about more than just a moment of lost temper. This was about who he had become as a person. His wealth had isolated him from the struggles that most people faced every day. I had forgotten what it meant to serve others, to sacrifice for something bigger than himself, to show humility and respect for people regardless of their social status. Marcus realized that he had a choice to make. He could fight the charges, hire the best lawyers money could buy, and try to minimize the consequences of his actions. Or he could face what he had done honestly, accept responsibility for his behavior, and try to make amends for the harm he had caused. The decision he made would determine not just his legal fate, but the kind of person he would be for the rest of his life. By morning, Marcus had made his decision. Against the advice of his lawyers and his public relations team, he was going to do something that shocked everyone who knew him. He was going to return to Buckingham Palace and find James Morrison. Was going to apologize in person, and he was going to try to make things right. His advisors told him it was a terrible idea that would only make the situation worse. But Marcus no longer cared about protecting his reputation or his business interests. Marcus arrived at the palace alone, without bodyguards or assistants. He had left Sarah at the hotel with instructions to cancel all his business meetings for the rest of the week. He waited outside the palace gates for over an hour, watching the guards and trying to spot James among them. Several tourists recognized Marcus from the news coverage and tried to take photos with him. But he politely declined and moved away from the crowds. When James finally appeared for his afternoon shift, Marcus felt his heart racing. The guard looked exactly the same as he had the day before, standing tall and proud in his red uniform. But now Marcus knew the real story behind the man in the ceremonial outfit. He knew about the medals for bravery, the 3 tours in Afghanistan, the disabled sister, and the financial struggles. James was not just a tourist attraction or a palace employee. He was a hero who deserved respect and admiration, not insults and violence. Marcus waited until James's shift ended before approaching him. He had practiced what he wanted to say during the long wait, but when he finally stood face to face with the man he had attacked, all his prepared words seemed inadequate. James looked at Marcus with surprise but no anger or fear. His expression was calm and professional, just as it had been during the incident the day before. "Mr. Morrison," Marcus said quietly, his voice shaking slightly, "I know you probably do not want to talk to me, and I understand if you walk away right now. But I need to apologize to you for what I did yesterday. There's no excuse for my behavior, and I am deeply ashamed of how I treated you." James studied Marcus's face for a moment before responding. He could see that the billionaire was genuinely distressed and remorseful, very different from the angry man who had confronted him the day before. James had been thinking about the incident as well, trying to understand what had driven Marcus to act so aggressively. He had seen similar behavior from stressed soldiers and from civilians who were dealing with personal problems. "Mr. Wellington," James said in a calm voice, "I accept your apology. What you did was wrong, but I can see that you understand that now. I do not hold grudges against people who are willing to admit their mistakes and try to make things right." Marcus was surprised by James's gracious response. He had expected anger, resentment, or at least coldness from the man he had humiliated in front of hundreds of people. Instead, James was showing the same dignity and professionalism that he had displayed during the attack itself. Marcus realized that this was what real strength looked like, not the bullying behavior he had shown the day before. "I learned about your military service and your sister," Marcus continued. "I had no idea who you really were or what you have been through. You are a hero who has served your country with honor, and you are making incredible sacrifices to care for your family. I am ashamed that I treated someone like you with such disrespect." James nodded but did not say anything about his personal life. He was a private person who did not like to discuss his problems or his achievements with strangers. However, he could tell that Marcus had genuinely been affected by learning about his background. The billionaire seemed like a different person than he had been the day before, more humble and thoughtful. "I want to help you," Marcus said suddenly. "I know that you are struggling to pay for your sister's medical care, and I want to do something to make up for what I did to you. Please, let me help with her treatments and expenses. It is the least I can do after the way I behaved." James was quiet for a long moment, considering Marcus's offer. He had been raised to be independent and to solve his own problems without asking for help from others. Taking money from the man who had attacked him felt wrong somehow, like he would be taking advantage of Marcus's guilt. But he also thought about Emma and how much the treatments could help her condition. "That is very generous of you, James," said finally. "But I cannot just take your money because you feel bad about what happened. If you really want to help, then help me earn it. Give me a job or an opportunity to work for what my sister needs. Do not want charity, but I would be willing to work for you if you have something meaningful for me to do." Marcus was impressed by James's response. Even when offered a fortune to help with his sister's care, the guard insisted on earning the money rather than simply accepting it as a gift. This was exactly the kind of integrity and work ethic that Marcus had possessed when he was younger, before success and wealth had made him soft and entitled. "I have an idea," Marcus said, his mind already working on a plan. "I want to start a foundation to help military veterans and their families. People like you who have served their country but are struggling with medical bills, education costs, housing problems, and other challenges. I want you to run this foundation for me. You would know better than anyone what veterans really need and how to help them effectively." James was intrigued by the proposal. He had always wanted to do more to help his fellow veterans, many of whom were dealing with problems similar to his own. A foundation with significant funding could make a real difference in the lives of thousands of military families. It would also give James a way to use his military experience and his understanding of veteran issues to help others. Over the next hour, Marcus and James walked through the streets of London, discussing the details of the foundation. Marcus was amazed by James's knowledge and passion for veteran issues. The guard had ideas for programs that Marcus never would have thought of, from job training initiatives to mental health support services. James spoke about his fellow soldiers with the same dedication and loyalty that he showed toward his sister. By the end of their conversation, Kuza had committed to funding the foundation with $50 million, with James as its director. The foundation would be based in London, but would help veterans throughout the United Kingdom and eventually expand to other countries. James would receive a salary that would more than cover Emma's medical expenses. But more importantly, he would have the opportunity to make a difference in the lives of thousands of veterans and their families. The news of Marcus's foundation and his partnership with James spread quickly through the media. The story became a symbol of redemption and second chances, showing how a moment of terrible judgment could be transformed into something positive and meaningful. Marcus's reputation began to recover as people saw that he was genuinely trying to make amends for his actions. More importantly, Marcus himself felt like he had rediscovered his purpose and his values. James left his position as a Queen's Guard to become the full-time director of the Wellington Foundation for military families. Emma received the medical treatment she needed, and her condition began to improve significantly. The foundation grew rapidly, helping thousands of veterans with everything from medical bills to job placement to housing assistance. James became a respected advocate for veteran rights, speaking at conferences and working with government officials to improve services for military families. Marcus and James became unlikely friends, bonded by their shared experience and their commitment to helping others. Marcus learned valuable lessons about humility, service, and the true meaning of success. He realized that his wealth was not just for his own enjoyment, but could be used to make a real difference in the world. James taught him that true strength comes from helping others, not from dominating them. Years later, when people asked Marcus about the incident at Buckingham Palace, he would say it was the best thing that ever happened to him. It had forced him to confront the person he had become and to change his life for the better. The slap that had shocked the world had ultimately led to a friendship that changed both men's lives and helped thousands of other people along the way. Sometimes the worst moments in our lives can become the catalyst for the most important changes we ever make.